So it's well, I introduced him basically already. It's my pleasure to introduce Nathan Gibson, who will present tonight about towards a cyber infrastructure for Syriac literature, mapping text corpus using TI and RDF. Nathan is a postdoc at Vanderbilt and also in Munich.
Yes.
Spending some time in Munich. And has a PhD in Arabic and Syriac studies and literature.
Yes.
And was, before his postdoc, during his graduate studies, he was research assistant actually working for the Syriac project. So I just leave it to you.
Okay. Thank you, Matteo. And it's a real privilege to be here. I've been looking forward to this for quite some time. So let me get everything set up here. Okay. Well, I hope we don't have too many problems with the PowerPoint, but I think this will work. So you might be wondering about the meaning of two different terms in my title, the first being cyber infrastructure and the second being Syriac literature. So I'm actually going to start in Rome in the 1700s. We could start a lot of places, but I'll start there because the Romans were also wondering at that time about the meaning of Syriac literature. I don't think they were wondering about the meaning of cyber infrastructure. So Pope Clement XI in 1715 sent a young employee of the Vatican Library, a priest by the name of Joseph Simeon Assamani, to collect manuscripts from all over the Near East in languages such as Syriac and Arabic, among others. Assamani had been born in the mountains of Lebanon. In fact, his Arabic name was Al-Samani. It corresponds to something like the Simeonite. And he had enrolled in the Maronite College in Rome in 1703 at about age 16. The religious community to which he belonged, the Maronites, grew up as one of the many branches of Syriac Christianity that arose from the Aramaic-speaking communities across the Fertile Crescent. And those communities today would often identify themselves as speaking the language of Jesus. Their literary production has frequently been in the form of Aramaic called Syriac. This Syriac language first appears in inscriptions from a city in the region where northwest Syria meets northwest Mesopotamia. In fact, the city that Matteo just showed us, Edessa, or in Syriac, Urha. Today it's Urfa in southeastern Turkey. And from there, Syriac spread across the Middle East into Palestine and Lebanon, Mesopotamia, even the eastern Arabian Peninsula, Central Asia, and as a liturgical language even to India. It appears in inscriptions as far east as China, especially or most famously in the Xi'an Stela of AD 781, which recounts 150 years of Syriac Christianity in China. The popularity of Syriac in the Fertile Crescent began to wane with the rise of Arabic as the new lingua franca after the Arabic Muslim conquests of the 7th century. But it would continue strong for at least another 6 centuries, and despite the fact that Syriac communities are now a tiny minority of the population in the Middle East, and that their worldwide diasporas outnumber those living in the homeland, works of literature continue to be produced in Syriac right up to the present day. During the medieval period, Little Syriac seems to have found its way westward into Greek or Latin, and one could point to the decisions of church councils or policies of Roman, meaning Byzantine emperors, the Roman wars with the Persians or the Roman wars with the Muslim caliphs, European literacy rates. Whatever the reasons, they didn't prevent literature from going the other direction, from Greek into Syriac. In fact, the Greek classical and patristic works became a staple of the theological and philosophical thought in Syriac. Now, 2 centuries before Assamani, Eastern Christians immigrating to Europe from the Ottoman lands kindled Italian interest in the Syriac language, and in fact the humanist Tiseo Ambrogio degli Albanesi who was born 30 years after Gutenberg developed his printing press, learned Syriac from a Maronite delegation and prepared Syriac type along with an introduction to the Syriac Psalter. When his hometown of Pavia was destroyed by the French army in 1527, both the Syriac type he had developed and the manuscript of his work were lost, only to resurface, allegedly, in a sausage maker's wrapping paper. Spurred on by this blessed event, Albanese succeeded in publishing the first extensive treatment of Syriac grammar and first substantial literary texts known to Europeans. The title of his book should definitely be an inspiration to young philologists among us. It's called Introduction to Chaldean, Syriac, Armenian, and 10 Other Languages. Albanese in turn inspired the Bavarian Widmanstätter, who would work together with the Syrian Orthodox Bishop Moshe of Mardin, to print the first Syriac New Testament in 1555 in Vienna. And by the late 1500s and early 1600s, Roman presses, such as that of Asmani's own Maronite College, were publishing service books for congregations of the Syriac rite, as well as Syriac grammars. And farther north, the interest in the many language versions of Scripture led to the inclusion of Syriac in the famous Antwerp, Paris, and London polyglot Bibles. So, when Joseph Asmani left on his voyage in 1715, Romans were not oblivious to the existence of Syriac, but they could not fathom what Asmani no doubt conceived, the riches of the Syriac heritage, which included everything from folk tales to voluminous world chronicles, from scholarly treatises to technical jurisprudence and lofty liturgical poetry. 2 years later, he would return from visiting Syria, Lebanon, and Egypt with the delivery of precious manuscripts for the Vatican Library, many of which came from the monastery of the Syrians, Dair as-Suryan, in Wadi Natrun of the Egyptian desert. After a second productive trip, several years later, he was put in charge of the Vatican Library, a position he kept for the next 30 years, and over the course of his lifetime, he brought around 2,000 works to the Vatican Library. Today, it's one of the richest collections of Syriac manuscripts worldwide. Now, I share Asmani's story not just as an introduction to the world of Syriac literature, as Europeans encountered it, nor just as an example of the familiar but complex intertwining of European power with Middle Eastern intellectual history in the Orientalist enterprise, but as a story that reveals the factors which have typically hindered or promoted the study of Syriac literature from Asmani's time to the present. And as we'll see, it's these same factors that necessitate the creation of a cyberinfrastructure for Syriac literature. The two things that have been critical in the advancement of Syriac literature, and which Asmani experienced personally, could be labeled access and accident. It was because of Asmani's unique access to the Syriac language and Syriac manuscripts, and to corridors of power, that he could provide what may have been the greatest impetus ever for the study of Syriac literature. This was his voluminous publications, especially the 3 large volumes of his Bibliotheca Orientalis Clementino. This is Dair as-Suryan, and here's his Bibliotheca Orientalis Clementino, Vaticana. I'll just call it BO from now on. It's almost 3,000 pages of Latin and Syriac that surveyed the content of these precious Vatican manuscripts. And it also served as the first printed history of Syriac literature, as well as a guide to the Vatican's holdings alongside his catalog of Vatican Syriac manuscripts. Asmani was also fundamental in the project that printed the first edition and Latin translation of the works of Ephraim, the most famous Syriac author of all time. But Asmani's story also shows the role of accident in Syriac literature, if one may call it that. And I'll just give 2 examples. As I mentioned, many of the manuscripts he collected came from the Dair as-Suryan. Why the Syrians had set up a monastery in the Egyptian desert, and how one of its 10th century abbots had collected hundreds of manuscripts on a trip to Baghdad, is too long a story to tell. Suffice it to say that the circumstances of history and climate led to a wealth of Syriac literature being preserved in this particular monastery that is sometimes the earliest and sometimes the only attestation of particular works. Another far less fortunate accident was a fire in Asomani's Vatican apartment shortly after his death. And although he had planned 8 further volumes of Bibliotheca Orientalis beyond the 4 that he had already published, the material he prepared for these was partially destroyed by the fire. One wonders how Syriac literature might have advanced further had these been published. And so we enter the realm of the literature histories and manuscript catalogs, Asomani's being one of the most significant. But as we move on into the 1800s, we meet William Wright, who was certainly embedded in the colonialist enterprise of the British of bringing Eastern manuscripts into the collection of the British Library. He also obtained many of these manuscripts from Daira Suryan. And his catalog, again, a 3-volume catalog, thousands of pages, cataloging over 500 manuscripts, is really the gold standard of Syriac manuscript cataloging. It's extremely detailed, extremely informative, and yet, if you read Dave Michelson's article in the Journal of Religion and Media Communications, you'll see it was also quite biased in the direction of European Protestant interests at the time. Again, his access to these particular manuscripts formed the basis of Syriac literature, the study of Syriac literature from that point forward. And as we move forward into the 1900s, we meet Anton Baumstark, whose Geschichte der syrischen Literatur is really the most up-to-date, published in 1922, but the most up-to-date Syriac literature history that we have. Baumstark was a student of Saschau, who worked here in Berlin. He had access to all of these Berlin manuscripts, and that's why he could publish this extremely useful, but now very out-of-date, history of Syriac literature. We have literature histories, we have manuscript catalogs, but we have no true claves, no true catalogs of works, only catalogs of manuscripts. So something like the TLG, the Thesaurus Linguae Graecae, does not exist for Syriac. All we can do is consult Baumstark and hope that the particular work we're looking for is mentioned by him. So access and accident. And this continues into the digital age. So when I started my PhD studies a number of years ago, the digital age was already transforming the study of Syriac literature. But there was a problem. The access was not granted to anyone who enters the field. The access was granted only to those who do laborious work in discovering the tools of the trade. In other words, we were using the same 17th, 18th, 19th century tools to discover where on archive.org we should find page scans of a particular Syriac work. So if you look at archive.org today, you'll find many, many scans of Syriac works. But usually you have to know exactly who published it, who edited it, and so on to be able to find that information. The metadata is, quite frankly, terrible most of the time. And on top of that, we don't have OCR for Syriac. There have been some attempts where we hope that something is coming along right now, but at this point, there's no text recognition that we can run on Syriac page scans to make this process easier. There are many other archives where you could find page scans. I won't go into them. But we also have Syriac as, here we go, as page scans and databases. We have Syriac in FileMaker databases, such as one constructed by Ugo Zanetti several years ago. And ultimately, he found he didn't know what to do with this FileMaker database sitting on his computer that had thousands of hagiographical Syriac works cataloged. What do you do with it? Well, in the end, he turned it over to Syriaca.org and said, please help me do something with this, publish this in some digital form. And that's what we ended up doing through the Biblioteca Hagiografica Syriaca Electronica, the BHSE, which was the first volume of the new Handbook of Syriac Literature that we'll talk about in a moment. There are, of course, also efforts to construct bibliographies for Syriac literature. An effort at the Hebrew University of Jerusalem is the most comprehensive of these. And there are people typing in Syriac text manually. But compared to the amount of literature, for instance, you have on Perseus, Syriac literature that's actually typed in is a drop in the bucket. That brings us to our central question. How can Syriac literature overcome the vicissitudes of access and accident through cyber infrastructure? Well, first of all, what is a cyber infrastructure? We could define it in a number of different ways, and we could also call it digital infrastructure, e-infrastructure, a number of things. Crane, in this article that Matteo mentioned, calls it the material systems whereby we exchange the objects of our intellectual labor and ourselves internalize these objects. An ACLS report in 2006 said cyber infrastructure is the combination of tangible things like network, storage, software, and data with intangible things like expertise, best practices, standards, tools, collections, and collaborative environments. This is not so much a definition, but maybe a description. Anything that is needed to connect more than one person, project, or entity is infrastructure. And anything that is used exclusively by a project is not. So the working definition for this talk, I'll consider cyber infrastructure to be a framework that provides for the sharing of digital content, services, and tools. Three components. If you read the section by Alison Babu, she talks about it in these terms: content, services, and tools. Now, in terms of developing a cyber infrastructure, in Greek and Latin, this is my perception of it. Feel free to correct me, bring this up during the discussion time. In Greek and Latin, there was the physical infrastructure, the computing, and the physical resources, the collections. So the thesaurus lingua Gracchae was drawing on printed works, physical collections. It was putting it into a computing infrastructure, and voila, you have electronic resources, electronic collections. And it was on the basis of this that you could get cyber infrastructure. So Perseus identifies every Greek work using a TLG number. So that infrastructure, in a sense, had already been established in the sense of identification. But what we have in Syriac, as Matteo mentioned, we can use many of the same tools and approaches, except for one thing. There's a big gap. We start out with physical infrastructure and physical resources, but where we should have electronic resources, we don't. We have page scans, but not Syriac text. So how do we get a cyber infrastructure on top of that? And that's the main question that we've been racking our brains about. First, let's look at an example of cyber infrastructure in regard to Perseus. Now, I had this loaded on my computer, but that did not work. So if I can just exit out of this and open this up, I hope on a web browser. Here we have Perseus, and here we have a fairly new effort called Perseus Catalog. Now, what is the Perseus Catalog? If we search for Homer, we find, here's Homeric hymns. We have a TLG number. We have a URN. And we have works currently cataloged. If we go here and click on the work record, we come to how to find an edition, how to find a translation. And if we go here, that takes us to Perseus. Great. It seems simple, it seems straightforward, but there's a lot behind it. There's the cataloging of the TLG that made all of this possible. And Perseus combines the reading interface, the reading interface, which you could think of as the tools, for instance, the lexical parsing and all of that, with content, the actual text, with services such as the cataloging services as well that go into reviewing each record as it's uploaded, editorial review, all of that. So Perseus combines content, services, and tools all into one package. And that's why I would call it a cyber infrastructure. So what would a cyber infrastructure for Syriac literature be? Well, as I mentioned, there is no clavis for Syriac literary works as a whole. So we're trying to forge a path toward this cyber infrastructure. And one of the critical things in that path is the service of identifying works. So cataloging, essentially. But that cataloging has to serve multiple audiences. So if cyber infrastructure is content, services, and tools, we need more content, certainly. We need Syriac texts. People are working on that. But how are those Syriac texts going to be structured? How are they going to be related to each other, or to persons, or to places, or to Greek texts, to anything else? They need cataloging. So that's the service of providing, in this case, a URI for Syriac works. And that's the main project of the new Handbook of Syriac Literature, which I and Dave Michelson and several other people are working on right now. Let me just show you the new Handbook of Syriac Literature so you get a better idea of what I'm talking about. And I'm taking you to our draft website instead of our public website because I want to be able to show you some things that are in development. So let's take a look first at an author. Here we have Gregorius Bar-Hebraeus. We've collected his name in a lot of different languages, including Syriac, Arabic, Latin, I think French. He has relationships to places, as you'll see here. And all of this information comes from TEI. Now, the important thing about this record is that it's not his name, which is the identifier. It's this URI right here that is the identifier. And this URI is linked to other URIs, such as URIs in library catalogs that depend, for instance, on the Virtual International Authority file. So the German National Library, the Library of Congress in the US, all connect to this. You'll see how many libraries have records for Gregorius Bar-Hebraeus. We've submitted a Syriac name, as you can see here, to VF. And using the linked open data principles that Matteo mentioned, then we can connect out to these other sites, they can connect to us, and it's all done using the magic of URIs. I won't bore you with the details of that because I think you're probably familiar with that already. But when we go to the Handbook of Syriac Literature, here we have a work record. Again, this is identified by a URI. And we have a link to the author, and so on. And I'll go into the format of this in just a moment. First, I want to mention our purpose and goals. So we saw some needs. These needs, first of all, as I've mentioned several times, that there is no clavis of Syriac works. But that also means there are no uniform titles for library cataloging. So if you go to look up a Syriac work in a library, who knows what title you're going to find it under? It might be under a Latin title. It might be under your language title, English or German or whatever, with who knows what translation. It's absolute chaos. It was that way regarding authors. We're working on that problem through the Guide to Syriac Authors, but it's even worse in regard to Syriac works. But that also means there are no URIs for digital identification. So when worldcat.org or vf.org or these other sites that provide URIs to libraries go to catalog Syriac works, they're doing so on the basis of very poor metadata. The new Handbook of Syriac Literature aims to fill the need for a Syriac clavis in a digital context, primarily through providing identifiers, URIs, for Syriac works. So our goals then are not to construct an entire cyber infrastructure, but working toward the core features of a cyber infrastructure through these URIs, and in doing so serving multiple audiences. Those include researchers who can tag Syriac works in their digital research using Syriaca.org URIs, archivists who can archive using those URIs, and heritage communities who can come to the site and discover related resources to any particular work, author, and so on. What were our methodological decisions? Here we took a slightly strange track for most digital humanities projects. Not in the sense of the entities that we chose. The entities are authors or editors like Bar Hebraeus. The works and literary traditions like the one you just saw, Bar Hebraeus' Chronicle. But we did separate the works and literary traditions from bibliographic items. This is an important step that has been taken in recent decades in the library science community, in which there's an additional layer of cataloging. So there's a difference between the conceptual work, as we saw earlier, Homeric hymns, for example, and the edition or translation of that work. And we're trying to keep that distinction as we catalog Syriac works. But here's where we really took a departure. The formats. Now, if we want to serve library communities, you would normally think we would use a library format, something like MADS or EAC, XML formats that libraries are using. The problem we ran into, in fact, we started out trying to do that. The problem that we ran into is these formats didn't provide us the scholarly nuances that we needed to serve scholars as well as libraries. So, for example, TEI gives us a source attribute that we can attach to any data item. So any item of data, we can link to a bibliographic item to say, one or more bibliographic items to say, where does it come from? Now, originally that source attribute wasn't available for something like the title of a work. But we said, no, we need that source attribute to say, we're getting this title from this edition or from this manuscript, and so on. So far as we know, there aren't other projects that are cataloging works, as in conceptual entities, in a kind of full-fledged TEI format. Now, if you know of them, I would love to find out during the discussion, because we've been looking for this, and we had to pretty much invent our own schema for how to use TEI to catalog conceptual works. It's not easy going. But of course, TEI is not an end-all. We need the HTML page that's generated from the TEI, of course, but we're also looking at how do we generate RDF from TEI. We are not managing to go anywhere with this. Well, I'll have to explain it orally. How do we generate RDF from TEI? And there's a huge discussion going on in the TEI community, because everybody wants to do, a lot of people want to do this. Instead of creating one data record for TEI and then additional data for the RDF, which of course you run into all kinds of problems with trying to keep these synchronized and so on, it would be much better for us if we could run a conversion on the TEI that converts it into RDF. But even better than that would be if we had some shared standards within the TEI community for what certain things in TEI correlate to in RDF. And the SAWS project, Sharing Ancient Wisdoms, has moved things forward in this regard. Some other projects have as well. So in regard to conceptual works, what we're doing is we're taking RDF properties and we are putting them in TEI relation elements. So you have a relation, you have a ref attribute in the relation that points to an RDF property, and then you have the subject and the object of that relation. These are all of the things that are needed for an RDF statement. So it's embedded there in the TEI. We can run the conversion and generate RDF from it. We're also putting RDF classes on TEI elements that correspond to entities, so that then we can generate something like this work, chronography part 1, is a conceptual work in such and such vocabulary. I was going to show you some of the TEI, but I can't do that with the current setup. So let me move back to the presentation. What are our data sources then, since we don't have something like the TLG? First of all, digital manuscript catalogs. And there are a few of these that we can use. A number of manuscript repositories have been putting their manuscripts online and putting bibliographic information online with them sometimes. So the Vatican Library has been doing this. The Hill Museum and Manuscript Library, which has an enormous treasure trove of Syriac manuscripts, actually photographs of Syriac manuscripts, has been doing this. They have something like 20,000 Syriac manuscripts that they photographed, most of which have not even been cataloged yet. So we have a long ways to go in terms of Syriac literature, cataloging Syriac literature. David Michelson and his students at Vanderbilt University are creating a digital catalog from William Wright's 19th century catalog of Syriac manuscripts in the British Library. And depending on how you choose to go about this, it can be a very laborious process. So he and about 50 students to date have been working on this. And all of this manuscript information can be represented in great detail in TEI XML. And in fact, what I mentioned earlier about Wright's Protestant biases as he collected these Syriac manuscripts and as he described them, David Michelson is trying to reverse some of those biases through the nonlinear representation of digital information. So, in other words, where Wright's categorized manuscripts certain ways, split them up in certain ways, we can reunite them, we can recategorize them, we can have several different systems for accessing these manuscripts and portraying these manuscripts. We're using existing print and digital inventories like the Comprehensive Bibliography of Syriac Christianity that I mentioned earlier. Iktobe, a project from the CNRS in France, and individual subject clavices or author clavices for Ephraim or Philoxenus or other authors. So where does this take us in terms of future research that can be done in Syriac literature on the basis of a cyber infrastructure? I'll just give some examples. One is regarding authorship. So where traditionally the link to authorship has to be described either in one field in a database or using sometimes quite complicated prose, we can link works to authors using vocabularies of our own invention or vocabularies that are already in existence for pseudonymous authorship, for attributed authorship, for other types of complicated authorship scenarios that so far have been very poorly represented in cataloging data and in regard to Syriac literature. Another interesting feature is that we can also create records for authors whose names we don't know, because they're not identified by name, they're identified by URI. And so when we have anonymous authors of works, we can create records for those anonymous authors and potentially start to piece some things together in regard to other things we might happen to know about those anonymous authors. We can start looking at chronological trends and geographical trends, because when we don't have good cataloging information that's centered on Syriac works, in which Syriac works are identified by URI, it's impossible to run any sort of analyses, chronologically, geographically. And while some of these scholars of the past, people like Assamani or Wright, may have had a lot of it up here, now the sheer volume of Syriac literature, and with all of these manuscripts that have been collected around the world, is simply too great to do that sort of thing as a manual process. It has to be computed. We can look at what were the significant works. So we can reverse some of the biases in regard to works that have been most published, most edited, most often translated. Many Syriac works have not been edited yet. They're still lying in manuscript. And by using manuscript catalogs to construct this identification for Syriac works and ultimately a cyber infrastructure, we're no longer limited by the problems of access that limited people in the past who had to consult Assamani's catalog, Wright's catalog, and so on. As it turns out, those biases were often against things like monastic literature, things like hagiographic literature describing saints, and those can resurface as being significant works of Syriac literature. Let's look at one test case, which is Syriac biblical material, which we're in the process of compiling a volume on right now. So this is just using the British Library data, but I want you to imagine what we could do if, through identifying Syriac works properly with URIs and starting to create a cyber infrastructure, we could start correlating this kind, or conglomerating this kind of information, not just from the British Library, but from the Vatican Library, from the Berlin Staatsbibliothek, from places all over the world. So in this case, we have a peak in about the 600s for biblical manuscripts from the British Library, and I was able to limit this search on the basis of those work URIs that have been tagged in the electronic manuscript catalog. So a peak in the 600s, it becomes stable for a while, and then another peak around 1250 or so. This is all very preliminary, but just an example of what we can do with it. Here's another interesting question. What were the most common types of biblical works represented in manuscripts? So if usually monks, but whoever is copying the manuscript has to choose, what am I going to copy the most of? What do they choose? Well, the four Gospels in the Peshitta version, the standard Syriac version, the epistles of Paul, and the Catholic epistles, James, 1 Peter, and so on, turn out to be the most popular in this particular collection. Here's a question that would be really interesting to answer with Syriac manuscripts from all over the world, not just from the British Library. 1 Peter is part of the traditional Syriac version of the New Testament, the Peshitta version. But 2 Peter was not considered to be canonical, was not in the New Testament in the Syriac tradition for a very long time. And here we can look at when did 2 Peter first start appearing alongside 1 Peter in biblical manuscripts. And it turns out that in the 800s, in a particular version called the Hieroclensian that was based more directly from the Greek, we see it, but in the Peshitta version, we see it first appearing about 1000. Too little data here to actually make any conclusions, but this is the sort of thing that we could investigate. 1st through 3rd John is the same thing. where 1 John was considered canonical, but 2nd and 3rd John were not initially considered canonical in the Syriac tradition. And so whereas 1 John you see appearing as early as 400, 2nd and 3rd John we don't get until 800. These are just some of the examples of what we might be able to do in future research. And I would be very interested in your thoughts. Obviously, this is a work in process as we're investigating how to construct a cyber infrastructure given the data that we have. And I'd be very interested in hearing from you about how we can approach this question. Thank you.